Not every hero wore armor. Some carried buckets of, well, not gold. Tonight, let's step quietly into the muddy boots of one of the most underappreciated figures in medieval village life, the dung collector. A job that stank, yes, but one that kept the entire community running. From sunrise labor to strange superstitions, we're digging deep and maybe holding our noses as we explore the gritty, smelly, and surprisingly vital world of waste in history. So lie back, dossed, and prepare for a bedtime story that's oddly comforting and just a little gross. If strange old jobs and forgotten village routines help you unwind at night, you've found your quiet corner of the internet. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more softly told stories from the dustier corners of history. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. As the bells of Westminster Abbey chimed 9 times through the misty London evening of 1558, Thomas Muckhart began his descent into another world entirely. The cobbled streets that bustled with merchants, nobles, and common folk during daylight hours now belonged to creatures of a different sort. The gong farmers, those indispensable yet reviled servants of Tudor society whose very existence depended on what others wished to forget. Thomas pulled his rough woolen cap low over his weathered face and adjusted the leather apron that had long ago absorbed odors no amount of washing could eliminate. His boots, thick-soled and waterproofed with tallow, squelched slightly as he made his way through the narrow alleyways toward his night's destination. The cesspit beneath the grand house of Sir Edmund Whitmore, a prosperous wool merchant whose waste had been accumulating for the better part of 2 years. The term gong farmer itself spoke to the peculiar nature of this occupation, derived from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. It referred specifically to those who went into the most unpleasant places society had to offer. Yet the word farmer suggested cultivation, growth, productivity, ironic terms for men who harvested only what others had expelled from their bodies. Thomas had been in this profession for nearly 15 years, having inherited the position from his father, who had died not from old age, but from the toxic fumes that were an occupational hazard of their trade. The regulations governing gong farmers were as strict as they were necessary. Only permitted to work between the hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., these men emerged from their designated quarters in the city's most undesirable districts as darkness fell. Thomas lived in Grub Street alongside other night soilmen in a cramped tenement where the permanent stench of their profession clung to every surface despite their best efforts to wash it away. The authorities mandated this segregation not out of cruelty, but from practical necessity. The smell that accompanied a gong farmer was so overwhelming that it could clear a marketplace or send horses rearing in terror. Tonight's work would require a team of 4 men, as was typical for a large household cesspit. Thomas had arranged to meet his regular companions, young Geoffrey, barely 18 and new to the trade, whose job it was to descend into the pit itself. Simon, the ropeman, whose powerful arms could haul bucket after bucket of waste from depths that sometimes reached 12 feet, and old Willem, whose cart and horse would transport their malodorous cargo beyond the city walls to the designated lay stalls where night soil was deposited. The economics of the profession were both better and worse than most trades of the period. A gong farmer in service to Queen Elizabeth's court at Hampton Palace earned 6pence per day, a respectable wage that rivaled that of skilled craftsmen. The work, however, came with costs that no amount of money could truly compensate. The life expectancy of a gong farmer rarely extended beyond 40 years, and most died not from age-related ailments, but from the accumulated effects of their nightly exposure to methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic gases that rose from decomposing human waste. As Thomas approached Sir Edmund's residence, he could already detect the familiar, sweet-sick odour that indicated a cesspit in desperate need of attention. The wealthy merchant's house rose 3 stories above the street, its timber frame and plaster walls speaking to prosperity and social standing. But like all Tudor buildings, regardless of their grandeur, it rested upon a foundation of human necessity that someone like Thomas would eventually have to address. The cesspit lay beneath what was called the garderobe, a room that served as the household's primary toilet facility. These chambers were typically located in the upper floors of houses, connected to the cesspit by a shaft that could extend down 30 feet or more. During daylight hours, members of the household would sit upon wooden benches with holes carved through them, relieving themselves into the darkness below. Gravity and time would do the rest, creating the layered, compacted mass of waste that awaited Thomas and his team. Sir Edmund's steward, a thin man named Hartwell, met them at the servants' entrance with a mixture of necessity and disgust written plainly across his face. "The smell has become unbearable," he explained, holding a pomander to his nose. "The master insists it must be cleared tonight, completely." He gestured toward the back of the house where a wooden structure no larger than a garden shed marked the entrance to their workplace. The tools of their trade were simple but essential. Thomas carried a long-handled spade, specially designed for breaking apart the hard-packed layers of waste that accumulated over months and years. Young Geoffrey would descend with a smaller spade and several leather buckets, each fitted with rope handles. Simon had brought his pulleys and additional rope, while old Willem's cart waited in the alley, lined with large wooden barrels that would soon carry the night's harvest to its final destination. What many people of the time failed to understand was that this waste, however repulsive its collection might be, represented valuable fertilizer. The night soil collected by gong farmers was often spread on fields outside the city, where it would enrich the soil and increase crop yields. In some cases, the farmers who purchased this fertilizer paid handsomely for it, creating a secondary economy around what others considered mere refuse. But first came the collection, and that meant someone had to go down into the cesspit itself. Geoffrey, being the youngest and smallest of the group, drew this duty almost by default. The process required him to strip down to the bare minimum of clothing, a thin shirt and rough breeches that could be discarded if they became too saturated with waste. Over these, he wore a leather apron similar to Thomas's, though his would bear the brunt of direct contact with years of accumulated excrement. The descent began with removing the wooden covering that sealed the cesspit during the day. As soon as this barrier was lifted, the full force of the accumulated gases rushed upward in a visible cloud that made all 4 men step back and cover their faces. The smell was indescribable, not merely unpleasant, but actively assault on the senses that could cause immediate nausea and, in extreme cases, unconsciousness. Geoffrey lowered himself into the pit using a rope ladder carrying an oil lamp that provided the only illumination in the Stygian darkness below. The walls of the cesspit, lined with stones to prevent collapse, glistened with moisture that was better left unidentified. As he reached the bottom, his feet sank into a mixture that combined the consistency of thick mud with elements that defied comfortable description. The work itself was methodical, almost ritualistic in its precision. Geoffrey would use his spade to break apart the solid matter, filling bucket after bucket with the accumulated waste of the household above. Simon would haul each container to the surface using his rope and pulley system, while Thomas emptied the buckets into the larger barrels on Willem's cart. The process continued in steady rhythm, broken only by Geoffrey's occasional need to climb out for fresh air when the fumes became overwhelming. What made this work particularly challenging was not just the physical discomfort or the overwhelming stench, but the unpredictable nature of what lay beneath the surface. Years of waste created layers like geological strata, each representing different seasons, different diets, different members of the household. Sometimes, Geoffrey would uncover objects that had been dropped through the garderobe shaft. Coins, jewelry, or personal items that added unexpected value to the night's work. More disturbing were the occasional discoveries of small animals that had fallen into the pit, or evidence of household activities that the family above preferred to keep private. As the night progressed and the cesspit slowly emptied, a question began to form in Thomas's mind, one that had troubled him increasingly in recent months. How much longer could he continue this work? His breathing had become more labored over the past year, and he often found himself dizzy after particularly intense nights in the pits. He had seen too many fellow gong farmers succumb to what they called the pit sickness, a gradual weakening that seemed to eat away at a man's strength from the inside out. Yet what choice did he have? The work paid well enough to support his wife and 3 children, and unlike many trades, it required no guild membership or lengthy apprenticeship. A man could learn the basics in a few nights and be earning a full wage within a month, but the cost was always higher than anyone expected when they first took up the spade and bucket. As the church bells chimed midnight, marking the halfway point of their allowable working hours, Thomas paused to consider not just his own future, but the future of this entire profession. Already he had heard rumors of new ideas from the continent, systems that might make the work of gong farmers obsolete entirely. But until such innovations arrived in England, men like him would continue their nightly descent into the depths of human necessity, invisible guardians of public health whose very existence most people preferred to ignore. What would happen, he wondered, when dawn finally came and the city awakened to streets cleaned of the evidence of their essential work? The cesspit of Sir Edmund Whitmore proved deeper and more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. By 2 a.m, young Geoffrey had been working in the depths for over 4 hours, and the toll was becoming evident. Each time he emerged for air, his face appeared more pallid, his breathing more labored. The pit itself seemed to resist. Their efforts, as if decades of accumulated waste, had developed a malevolent consciousness of its own. How much deeper does this cursed thing go? Geoffrey gasped, pulling himself up the rope ladder for what Thomas counted as the 15th time that night. The young man's leather apron was completely saturated, and his thin shirt clung to his chest, stained with substances that would never wash clean. Thomas had seen pits like this before, cesspits that had been dug when the house was first constructed, then expanded over the years as the household grew and prospered. Some of the largest domestic cesspits in Tudor London extended down 20 feet or more, creating underground chambers that could hold the waste of an entire household for years at a time. The Whitmore pit appeared to be one of these architectural monstrosities, a testament to both human ingenuity and human necessity. The work required not just physical endurance, but a peculiar form of mental discipline. Geoffrey had to focus on the mechanical aspects of his task, the rhythm of the spade, the careful filling of each bucket, the systematic progress from one section of the pit to another. To think too deeply about what he was actually doing, to dwell on the reality of being surrounded by years of human excrement, was to invite the kind of mental breakdown that had claimed more than one gong farmer over the years. Simon, meanwhile, had developed his own coping mechanisms during his decade in the profession. As he hauled bucket after bucket to the surface, he occupied his mind with elaborate mental calculations. Tonight, he estimated they had already removed nearly 2 tons of waste, based on the weight of each bucket and the number of times he had operated his pulley system. At this rate, they would fill at least 8 of Willem's large barrels before dawn, a substantial haul that would earn each man a respectable night's wages. But Simon's calculations also included grimmer mathematics. He had worked with 17 different gong farmers over the years, and only 5 were still alive. 3 had died from what doctors called putrid fever, a wasting illness that seemed to eat away at the lungs and eventually the entire body. 4 had succumbed to accidents in the pits themselves, either from falls or from being overcome by toxic gases. 2 had simply disappeared one night, presumably having decided that even starvation was preferable to another descent into the depths of human waste. The most disturbing statistic in Simon's mental ledger concerned the children of gong farmers. Of the 23 offspring he could recall among his colleagues, only 8 had survived to adulthood, and none had chosen to follow in their father's profession. The work that sustained their families also seemed to curse them, as if the very act of handling human waste on such an intimate level carried with it a form of spiritual contamination that affected not just the workers themselves, but their entire bloodlines. Old Willem, waiting with his cart in the alley behind the house, had his own concerns as the night progressed. His horse, a sturdy mare named Patience, had become increasingly agitated as the barrels on the cart grew heavier and more aromatic. The animal had learned to associate these nocturnal expeditions with smells that triggered every instinct to flee, and Willem found himself spending as much energy managing his horse as he did managing his cargo. The route from collection point to disposal site required careful planning. The night soil had to be transported beyond the city boundaries to designated lay stalls, areas specifically set aside for the disposal of human waste. But the journey through London's narrow streets presented its own challenges. Even at night, there were watchmen, late travelling merchants, and other citizens who might encounter Willem's cart and its malodorous cargo. The penalties for improper disposal were severe and deliberately humiliating. One London gong farmer had been forced to stand in Golden Lane, confined up to his neck in one of his own collection pipes, with a sign detailing his crime, displayed for public ridicule. The authorities took waste disposal seriously, understanding that improper handling could lead to the spread of disease throughout the city's population. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself reflecting on the peculiar social position that he and his colleagues occupied. They were simultaneously essential and reviled, well-paid and socially ostracized, visible in their work, yet invisible in their humanity. The very people whose waste they collected would cross the street to avoid them during daylight hours, yet those same people depended utterly on their services for basic sanitation and public health. The profession had created its own culture, its own traditions and superstitions. Gong farmers had developed elaborate rituals for protecting themselves from the dangers of their work. Before descending into a pit, many would drink a mixture of gin and herbs that was supposed to protect against toxic fumes. They carried small leather pouches filled with aromatic substances, crushed mint, lavender, or even more exotic spices for those who could afford them, which they would inhale when the stench became overwhelming. Most importantly, they had developed an intricate system of mutual support and protection. When a gong farmer died, his colleagues would ensure that his family received enough money to survive until the widow could find other means of support. When a man became too ill to work, others would cover his assigned pits until he recovered, or until it became clear that he never would. The work also required a detailed understanding of structural engineering and construction techniques. A gong farmer had to assess the stability of cesspit walls, identify potential collapse hazards, and understand the flow patterns of waste and groundwater that could affect both safety and efficiency. Thomas had learned to read the signs that indicated a pit might be nearing structural failure: the slight inward lean of stone walls, the presence of unusual moisture patterns, the sound that voices made when echoing from different depths. By 3 a.m, Geoffrey had worked his way down to what appeared to be the bottom of the cesspit, but Thomas was beginning to worry about the young man's condition. His movements had become sluggish, and he was taking longer breaks between periods of work. The signs were familiar: the gradual onset of what gong farmers called pit madness, a combination of oxygen deprivation, toxic gas exposure, and the psychological strain of working in such conditions. "Bring him up," Thomas called to Simon. "I'll finish the last section myself." The decision was not made lightly. Thomas was 20 years older than Geoffrey and had already spent more time exposed to pit gases than was wise, but he had also developed a tolerance for the conditions that came only from years of experience, and he could recognize the signs of impending collapse that might claim a younger, less experienced worker. As Thomas prepared to make his own descent into the cesspit, he found himself wondering about the people who had contributed to this accumulation of waste. Sir Edmund Whitmore and his family lived their daily lives in the floors above, probably giving little thought to where their bodily waste went after they relieved themselves. Did they ever consider the men who would eventually have to handle what they had expelled? Did they think about the system that made their comfortable, hygienic lifestyle possible? The irony was not lost on Thomas that his profession, so reviled by polite society, was actually one of the foundations upon which that society rested. Without gong farmers, the cities of Tudor England would quickly become uninhabitable cesspools of disease and contamination. Yet the very people who made urban civilization possible were forced to live on its margins, segregated and stigmatized for performing work that everyone needed but no one wanted to acknowledge. What would happen, Thomas wondered, as he began his descent into the depths, when the current generation of gong farmers grew too old or too sick to continue their work? Who would take their place, and would society finally be forced to confront the reality of its dependence on those it preferred to ignore? The first hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky when Thomas finally emerged from the Whitmore cesspit for the last time. His legs trembled as he climbed the rope ladder, and his lungs burned with each breath of the relatively fresh morning air. Behind him, the pit stood empty for the first time in nearly 3 years, its stone walls glistening with moisture, but no longer harboring the accumulated waste of the household above. Young Geoffrey sat slumped against the wall of the shed, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The night's work had pushed him to the limits of human endurance, and Thomas could see in the young man's eyes the same question that haunted every gong farmer. How many more nights like this could a person survive? Simon was already breaking down his pulley system and coiling his ropes with the efficient movements of long practice. His mental calculations indicated they had removed nearly 3 tons of waste during the night, a substantial haul that would require 2 trips to the lay stalls beyond the city walls. Old Willem's cart groaned under the weight of 10 full barrels, each sealed as tightly as possible, but still emanating an odour that would announce their passage through the streets of London. The economics of the night's work were favourable, as Thomas had expected. Sir Edmund's steward paid them 4 shillings for the complete cleaning of the cesspit, a sum that would be divided among the 4 men according to their established shares. Thomas, as the master gong farmer who had negotiated the contract, would receive a full share. Simon and Willem would each receive 3/4 of a share, while Geoffrey, as the newest member of the team, would earn half a share until he gained more experience. But money, Thomas had learned over his 15 years in the profession, was only one measure of what the work cost. As he watched Geoffrey struggle to regain his composure, he calculated the true price of their night's labor in terms that no ledger book could record. The young man had aged visibly during his hours in the pit, acquiring the hollow-eyed look that marked all gong farmers after their first season of regular work. The transformation was not merely physical, something fundamental changed in a person after they had spent time working in the accumulated waste of their fellow human beings. It was impossible to maintain certain illusions about human nature, about dignity, about the structures that separated civilization from barbarism. Gong farmers developed a perspective on society that was both more realistic and more compassionate than that of most people, understanding as they did the basic biological equality that united all human beings regardless of wealth or social position. As the team prepared to make their way to the disposal sites outside the city, Thomas reflected on the broader implications of their work. The waste they had collected represented more than just the bodily functions of the Whitmore household. It was a record of their diet, their health, their daily routines, even their social activities. An experienced gong farmer could read the layers of a cesspit like a scholar reading a book, identifying periods of feast and famine, sickness and health, prosperity and hardship. The night soil they had harvested would soon be spread on the fields surrounding London, where it would enrich the soil and contribute to the crops that would eventually feed the city's population. This cycle of waste and renewal was one of the fundamental processes that made urban civilization possible, yet it remained largely invisible to most city dwellers. They consumed food grown with the help of human waste, but preferred not to think about the connection between their dinner table and the cesspit beneath their house. Willem's cart rumbled through the empty streets as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between the timber-framed buildings. The few people they encountered during this journey, early rising bakers, milkmaids making their rounds, watchmen ending their nocturnal duties, gave the cart a wide berth. Some held cloths to their noses, while others simply turned away and pretended not to see the mobile evidence of what their own bodies produced daily. The lay stalls on the outskirts of London were vast fields dedicated to the disposal of the city's waste. Here, night soil was spread in carefully managed layers, allowed to decompose and mature before being sold to farmers throughout the surrounding countryside. The process was overseen by a class of entrepreneurs who had built profitable businesses around what others considered worthless refuse. Thomas had heard rumors that some of these waste merchants were becoming quite wealthy, accumulating fortunes that rivaled those of more conventional traders. The irony was striking. While the men who collected the waste lived in poverty and social isolation, those who processed and sold it were gaining respectability and financial success. It was another reminder of how society valued different forms of labor, rewarding those who worked with money and contracts while stigmatizing those who worked with their hands in the fundamental processes of human necessity. As they unloaded the barrels at the lay store, Thomas found himself in conversation with Robert Ashby, one of the waste merchants who managed this particular site. Ashby was a prosperous man in his 50s, well-dressed and articulate, who had built his business around the systematic collection and processing of London's human waste. The demand for night soil continues to grow, Ashby explained as he inspected the quality of their delivery. Farmers, as far as Surrey, are willing to pay premium prices for well-aged waste from prosperous households. They claim it produces better crops than the waste from poorer districts. The conversation revealed another layer of complexity in the waste economy. Not all night soil was considered equal. Waste from wealthy households with their richer diets and better health was valued more highly than waste from poor districts where disease and malnutrition were common. Even in the most basic biological functions, social class distinctions persisted. By the time they had completed both trips to the lay stalls and returned Willem's cart to its shed, the sun was high enough to mark the official end of their working hours. The four men gathered in a small tavern that catered to night workers, a dim, smoky establishment where gong farmers, watchmen, and others who labored while the city slept could find food and drink without facing the prejudice they encountered. In more respectable establishments, over bread and ale, they discussed the night's work and planned for future contracts. Geoffrey, despite his exhaustion, was eager to continue learning the trade. He had earned 10 pence for his first major cesspit cleaning, more money than he could make in a week as a common labourer. The physical cost was high, but the economics opportunity was undeniable. Thomas, however, found himself troubled by thoughts that extended beyond the immediate concerns of their profession. He had begun to notice changes in the city's waste patterns that suggested larger social and economic transformations. The cesspits of wealthy households were filling more quickly than in previous decades, suggesting not just population growth but changes in diet and consumption patterns. Moreover, he had heard increasing talk of new approaches to waste management that were being developed in other parts of Europe. There were rumors of systems that could move waste through underground channels without requiring men to descend into pits, of mechanical devices that could process human waste without the need for manual collection and transport. What would happen to men like him if such innovations came to London? The question haunted Thomas as he made his way home through the awakening city. His profession had existed for centuries, adapting to changes in urban development and population growth. But the changes he sensed approaching seemed more fundamental, potentially eliminating the need for gong farmers entirely. As he reached his tenement in Grub Street, Thomas could already smell the morning cooking fires and hear the sounds of families beginning their daily routines. His own wife and children would be stirring soon, preparing for another day in which they would try to live normal lives despite the stigma attached to their father's profession. The irony was overwhelming. Thomas had spent the night ensuring that one of London's wealthiest households could continue to live in comfort and cleanliness, yet he returned home to a neighbourhood that most citizens considered a source of contamination and social disorder. He had performed work that was essential to the health and prosperity of the entire city, yet his reward was to be segregated from the society he served. But perhaps, Thomas thought, as he settled into his bed for a few hours of sleep before the next night's work, that was simply the nature of civilization itself, built on the labor of those it preferred not to see, dependent on systems it preferred not to acknowledge, sustained by people it preferred to forget. And tomorrow night, when darkness fell again, he would descend once more into the depths of human necessity, carrying out the work that made the city possible while remaining invisible to those who benefited from his labor. What stories, he wondered, would tomorrow night's pits have to tell? In the autumn of 1326, as the leaves turned brown along the Thames and the first frost touched the thatched roofs of London, a man named Richard earned his daily bread by collecting what others discarded. His surname, the Raker, identified both his profession and his social position in the complex hierarchy of medieval London. He was one of perhaps 50 men in the city who specialized in the collection and removal of human waste, a profession both essential and despised in equal measure. Richard lived in a narrow tenement near Cripplegate, one of the ancient gates that punctured London's medieval wall. The area was home to the city's least prosperous residents, labourers, servants, and those who worked in occupations that polite society preferred to ignore. His dwelling consisted of a single room on the ground floor of a timber-framed building that housed 6 families, each occupying their own cramped space in a structure that seemed to lean precariously toward the street. The building, like most, in that district had been constructed without much thought to sanitation or hygiene. A single communal cesspit served all 6 families located in the small courtyard behind the structure. The pit was perhaps 8 feet deep and 4 feet across, lined with stones that had been scavenged from various construction sites around the city. It was Richard's responsibility, as the only resident with professional expertise in waste management, to ensure that this cesspit was properly maintained and periodically emptied. But Richard's primary work lay elsewhere, in the larger and more prosperous households scattered throughout London's growing commercial district. The city in 1326 was entering a period of significant growth and prosperity, driven by expanding trade with continental Europe and the increasing sophistication of English manufacturing. Wealthy merchants were building larger houses, supporting bigger households and generating correspondingly greater volumes of waste. The technology of waste management in medieval London was both simple and ingenious. Most substantial houses included what was called a garderobe, a small room typically located on an upper floor that served as the household's primary toilet facility. The garderobe was positioned over a shaft that extended down into a cesspit dug beneath the house's foundation. Some of the more elaborate garderobes included stone or wooden seats with holes carved through them, providing a degree of comfort and reducing the risk of accidents. The cesspits themselves varied enormously in size and construction quality. The wealthiest households employed skilled masons to create elaborate underground chambers, lined with dressed stone and designed to contain waste for extended periods without leakage or structural failure. Poorer households made do with simple pits lined with whatever materials they could afford, rough stones, salvaged timber, or in some cases no lining at all. Richard's expertise lay in understanding the technical aspects of these systems and knowing how to safely empty them when they became full. The work required not just physical strength and tolerance for unpleasant conditions, but a detailed knowledge of construction techniques, soil conditions, and the behavioral patterns of waste accumulation. A skilled raker could assess a cesspit's condition, estimate how long it had been since the last cleaning, and identify potential structural problems that might make the work dangerous. The economics of the profession were complex and often precarious. Richard earned his income through a combination of regular contracts with established households and occasional one-time cleanings for customers who needed immediate attention. The rates varied according to the size and difficulty of the job, but typically ranged from 6 pence to 2 shillings for a complete cesspit cleaning, substantial sums for the period, equivalent to several days' wages for a common labourer. However, the work was seasonal and unpredictable. During the winter months, when ground conditions made digging difficult and transportation problematic, demand for raker services declined significantly. Richard had learned to save money during the busy summer and autumn seasons to sustain himself and his family through the lean months of winter and early spring. The tools of his trade were simple but essential. Richard owned a collection of spades and shovels designed for different types of excavation work, several leather buckets of various sizes, and a substantial length of rope for hauling materials up from deep pits. He also maintained a small wooden cart pulled by hand that could transport waste from collection sites to the designated disposal areas outside the city walls. Perhaps most importantly, Richard had developed relationships with other men who worked in related professions. He regularly collaborated with a carter named William, who owned a horse and wagon capable of handling larger loads, and with a stone mason named Hugh, who could make emergency repairs to cesspit walls that showed signs of collapse. These partnerships were essential for handling the larger and more complex jobs that provided the most substantial income. The social aspects of Richard's profession were complicated and often contradictory. On one hand, his work was recognized as essential to public health and urban sanitation. The authorities in medieval London understood that proper waste disposal was crucial for preventing the spread of disease and maintaining livable conditions in the increasingly crowded city. Regulations required households to maintain their cesspits properly and to arrange for regular cleaning by qualified professionals. On the other hand, the nature of the work created an almost unbridgeable social gap between rakers and the rest of society. Richard and his colleagues were necessary but not welcome, essential but not respected. They were required to live in designated areas of the city, prohibited from working during daylight hours when their activities might offend the sensibilities of more respectable citizens, and generally excluded from the social and economic networks that connected other trades and professions. The isolation was perhaps most evident in matters of marriage and family life. Richard's wife Alice was the daughter of another raker, and their 2 children would almost certainly follow in their father's profession unless they could somehow acquire the capital and connections necessary to enter a more respectable trade. The work created its own hereditary caste, perpetuating itself through generations of families who had little choice but to accept the social stigma that came with economic necessity. Yet Richard took pride in his work and in the knowledge that he possessed. He understood the underground infrastructure of London in ways that few other people could claim, knowing the location and condition of hundreds of cesspits throughout the city. He could read the signs that indicated a household's economic condition, health status, and even dietary habits based on the contents and condition of their waste disposal systems. The work also provided Richard with a unique perspective on the social dynamics of medieval London. In the depths of a cesspit, the waste of lord and servant, merchant and labourer mixed together in democratic equality. The fundamental biological processes that all humans shared became impossible to ignore when one spent one's working life dealing with their end product. This perspective gave rakers a certain philosophical detachment from the social hierarchies that dominated surface society. As autumn deepened toward winter in 1326, Richard found himself increasingly busy with requests for cesspit cleanings. Many households preferred to have this work done during the cooler months when the smells were less overwhelming and the risk of disease transmission was reduced. He had lined up several major contracts that would provide steady income through the end of the year. Among these was a particularly challenging job at the house of a wealthy wool merchant named Thomas Coventry, located near the Guildhall in the heart of London's commercial district. The Coventry household included not just the merchant's immediate family, but several servants, apprentices, and business associates who lived on the premises. Their cesspit had not been cleaned in over 3 years and was reported to be nearly full to capacity. Richard had inspected the site several weeks earlier and determined that the job would require at least 2 full nights of work, probably 3. The cesspit was unusually deep, nearly 12 feet, and the waste had been allowed to accumulate until it was packed almost solid. The work would be physically demanding and potentially dangerous, as deep cesspits presented risks of structural collapse and toxic gas accumulation, but the payment would be correspondingly generous. Thomas Coventry had agreed to pay 5 shillings for a complete cleaning, plus an additional payment if the work required more than the estimated time. For Richard, this single contract represented more income than he typically earned in a month of smaller jobs. As he prepared for this major undertaking, Richard found himself reflecting on the strange trajectory that had brought him to this profession. He had not chosen to become a raker. The work had chosen him through a combination of family circumstances, economic necessity, and the limited opportunities available to someone of his social background. Yet over the years, he had developed genuine expertise and took satisfaction in work that was both essential and challenging. What Richard could not have known as he gathered his tools and made his preparations for the Coventry contract was that this job would mark the end of his career and his life. The cesspit beneath Thomas Coventry's prosperous house held dangers that even an experienced raker could not anticipate, and the coming nights would test the limits of medieval waste management technology in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. But that knowledge lay hidden in the future, as unknowable as the contents of the deep pit that awaited him. For now, Richard the Raker prepared for another night's work, secure in his expertise and confident in his ability to handle whatever challenges the London underworld might present. What mysteries and dangers, he might have wondered, lay buried in the depths of the city's most prosperous cesspit. The night of November 15th, 1326, began like countless others in Richard the Raker's professional life. The autumn air carried the familiar mix of smoke from countless hearth fires, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, and the ever-present undertones of human habitation that characterized medieval London. Richard had arranged to meet his collaborators, William the Carter, and young Tom, a new apprentice eager to learn the trade, at the Coventry House just after the bells of St. Paul's chimed 9 times. Thomas Coventry's residence stood as a testament to the growing prosperity of London's merchant class. The 3-story timber-framed building occupied a substantial plot near the Guildhall, its upper floors jutting out over the street in the characteristic style of the period. Lead-glazed windows reflected the flickering light of street torches, and the heavy oak door bore iron fittings that spoke of both wealth and security concerns in a city where crime was an ever-present threat. The cesspit lay beneath a wooden structure at the rear of the property, accessible through a courtyard that also housed the kitchen gardens, servants' quarters, and storage buildings that supported the main household. Richard had studied the site carefully during his preliminary inspection, noting the stone-lined walls of the pit and the wooden covering that sealed it during periods of non-use. What had impressed Richard during his earlier visit was the apparent quality of the construction. The cesspit had been excavated and lined by skilled masons, with dressed stones fitted together in a pattern that suggested both durability and attention to detail. The opening was surrounded by a stone curb that extended several inches above ground level, designed to prevent surface water from flowing into the pit during heavy rains. But quality construction, Richard knew from experience, could create its own hazards. Well-built cesspits were often deeper than simpler structures, and their stone linings could trap gases that might otherwise dissipate harmlessly into the surrounding soil. The very features that made them more effective at containing waste could also make them more dangerous for the men who had to clean them. The tools for this particular job included several items that Richard used only for the most challenging contracts. In addition to his standard spades and buckets, he had brought a longer rope, nearly 40 feet, and a set of wooden planks that could be used to create a platform over the pit opening. For deep cesspits, safety required that someone remain at the surface to assist the worker below and to provide emergency help if needed. Young Tom, despite his inexperience, had been specifically chosen for this job because of his small stature and apparent comfort with confined spaces. At barely 18 years old and weighing perhaps 8 stone, he could navigate the narrow confines of a deep cesspit more easily than larger men. Richard had trained him carefully over the past month, teaching him the essential skills of breaking up compacted waste, filling buckets efficiently, and recognizing the warning signs of dangerous gas accumulation. William's role was to manage the transportation of waste from the pit to his wagon, then to the designated lay stalls outside the city walls. His horse-drawn cart could carry much, larger loads than Richard's hand-pulled vehicle, making it possible to complete a major cleaning in fewer trips. William had also brought several large wooden barrels that could be sealed more effectively than open buckets, reducing both spillage and odour during the journey through London streets. The removal of the wooden covering revealed the full scope of the challenge that awaited them. The pit extended down approximately 12 feet, with stone walls that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of their torchlight. The surface of the accumulated waste was perhaps 2 feet below the opening, indicating that the pit was indeed nearly full to capacity. The smell that rose from the depths was overwhelming even by the standards of experienced waste collectors. Richard's plan was methodical and based on years of experience with similar situations. Tom would descend into the pit and work systematically from the top down, breaking up the compacted waste and filling buckets that would be hauled to the surface by rope. Richard would remain at the surface to manage the hauling operation and to monitor Tom's condition for signs of exhaustion or gas exposure. William would transport the filled barrels to the disposal site and return for additional loads as needed. The descent itself required careful preparation. Tom stripped down to his lightest clothing and tied a rope around his waist as a safety line. He carried a small oil lamp to provide illumination in the depths, along with his spade and several leather buckets. The rope ladder that would allow him to climb in and out of the pit was secured to iron rings that had been embedded in the stone curbing for exactly this purpose. As Tom began his descent, Richard was struck by how the pit seemed to swallow both light and sound. The young man's lamp created a small circle of flickering illumination that revealed the texture of the stone walls and the surface of the waste, but everything beyond that circle remained in impenetrable darkness. Even Tom's voice seemed muffled and distant when he called up from the bottom of the pit. The work itself proceeded according to established routine. Tom used his spade to break apart the layers of compacted waste which had formed distinct strata corresponding to different periods of accumulation. The oldest material at the bottom of the pit had compressed into an almost solid mass that required considerable effort to excavate. The newer deposits near the surface retained more of their original texture and were correspondingly easier to handle. Richard had developed a system for monitoring the quality of air in deep cesspits based on the behavior of flame from oil lamps. A steady, bright flame indicated adequate oxygen levels, while a dim or flickering flame suggested the presence of dangerous gases. Throughout the first hour of work, Tom's lamp burned steadily, and his reports from the bottom of the pit indicated no unusual problems. The contents of the Coventry cesspit told their own story about the household above. Richard could identify periods of feast and relative famine based on the varying composition of the waste layers. The presence of expensive spices and exotic foods in some sections indicated times of prosperity and celebration, while simpler fare in other layers suggested either seasonal variations or temporary economic difficulties. More disturbing were the indications of illness that appeared in some layers, evidence of digestive ailments that had affected members of the household during the past 3 years. Richard had learned to read these signs as a form of archaeological evidence, understanding that the health and circumstances of a family could be reconstructed from careful examination of their accumulated waste. By midnight, they had made substantial progress. Tom had worked his way down approximately 4 feet into the pit, filling and dispatching nearly 30 buckets of waste. William had completed 2 trips to the lay stalls and returned with empty barrels ready for the next load. The work was proceeding faster than Richard had anticipated, suggesting that they might complete the entire job in 2 nights, rather than the 3 he had originally estimated. But Richard was beginning to notice subtle changes in the conditions at the bottom of the pit. Tom's voice sounded different, slightly hoarse and occasionally interrupted by coughing fits. The young man was taking longer breaks between periods of active work, climbing partway up the rope ladder to breathe the cleaner air near the surface. Most concerning, his lamp seemed to be burning less brightly than it had earlier in the evening. The changes were gradual enough that they might have been attributed to normal fatigue, and the accumulated effects of working in unpleasant conditions. Tom was still responsive to Richard's questions and continued to work at a steady pace. But Richard's experience had taught him to pay attention to subtle warning signs that might indicate more serious problems developing. As the night progressed, toward its midpoint, Richard found himself facing a decision that would determine not just the success of this particular contract, but potentially the life of his young apprentice. The signs he was observing could indicate the beginning of dangerous gas accumulation in the depths of the pit, a condition that could develop rapidly and with little warning in deep, well-sealed cesspits like the one beneath the Coventry house. The safest course would be to halt work immediately and allow the pit to ventilate for several hours before continuing. But this would extend the project into a third night, reducing their profit margin and potentially creating scheduling conflicts with other contracts. Moreover, the signs Richard was seeing were still subtle enough that he could not be certain. They indicated genuine danger rather than normal fatigue. The decision was complicated by the knowledge that Tom was depending on this work for income that would help support his widowed mother and younger siblings. The young man had been eager to prove himself capable of handling challenging assignments, and had specifically requested to be included in this lucrative contract. Stopping work prematurely might be seen as a reflection on his competence and could affect his future opportunities in the profession. As Richard weighed these considerations, he found himself wondering about the nature of the risks they faced. Medieval understanding of the dangers associated with cesspit cleaning was based on practical experience rather than scientific knowledge. Rakers knew that deep pits could be dangerous, and they had developed various techniques for minimizing risks, but they had no understanding of the specific gases involved or the mechanisms by which those gases could cause illness or death. What Richard could not have known was that the conditions in the Coventry cesspit were creating a perfect environment for the accumulation of methane and hydrogen sulfide, gases that could displace oxygen and create a lethal atmosphere in the confined space at the bottom of the pit. The very quality of construction that had impressed him during his preliminary inspection was now working against them, creating a sealed environment that trapped dangerous gases rather than allowing them to dissipate. As the church bells chimed, 1 o'clock in the morning, marking the deepest hour of the medieval night, Richard made the decision that would seal Tom's fate, and ultimately his own. Rather than stopping work to allow for ventilation, he chose to continue with the contract, trusting in the techniques and precautions that had served him well throughout his career. What he did not realize was that some dangers lie beyond the reach of experience and precaution, waiting in the depths where even the most skilled professionals venture at their peril. The first sign that something had gone seriously wrong came not from Tom's voice, but from its absence. Richard had been hauling up a particularly heavy bucket of waste when he realized that the steady rhythm of scraping and shoveling from the bottom of the pit had ceased. He called down into the darkness, his voice echoing off the stone walls, but received no response other than the faint sound of liquid dripping somewhere in the depths. "Tom!" Richard shouted, his voice carrying a note of urgency that brought William running from where he had been loading barrels onto his cart. "Can you hear me, lad?" The silence that rose from the pit was more ominous than any cry of distress would have been. Richard knew from experience that men overcome by pit gases rarely had the opportunity to call for help. They simply collapsed where they stood, overcome by invisible poisons that could kill within minutes. Without hesitation, Richard began to lower himself into the pit, using the rope ladder. William grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "You can't go down there," William said urgently. "If the gases have taken the boy, they'll take you too." But Richard's sense of responsibility to his apprentice overrode his concern for his own safety. He had brought Tom to this job, had trained him, had made the decision to continue working despite the warning signs. If the young man was in danger, Richard could not abandon him to save himself. The descent into the pit revealed the full horror of what had occurred. Tom lay crumpled at the bottom of the excavation, his body partially submerged in the liquid waste that had accumulated in the deepest section. His oil lamp had gone out, leaving the bottom of the pit in complete darkness that was broken only by the faint light from Richard's own torch. The air at the bottom of the pit was thick and oppressive, with a quality that made breathing difficult and caused immediate dizziness. Richard could feel his own strength beginning to ebb as he struggled to reach Tom's unconscious form. The gases that had overcome his apprentice were now affecting him as well, creating a deadly trap that threatened to claim both men. With enormous effort, Richard managed to secure a rope around Tom's limp body and signal for William to begin hauling the young man to the surface. But the exertion required for this rescue, combined with his continued exposure to the toxic atmosphere at the bottom of the pit, had pushed Richard beyond his physical limits. As William pulled Tom's unconscious form up the rope ladder, Richard felt his own consciousness beginning to fade. The irony of the situation was not lost on Richard, even as he struggled against the effects of the poison gases. He had spent 15 years working in cesspits throughout London, had developed techniques and precautions that had kept him safe through hundreds of dangerous descents. Yet here, in what appeared to be one of the best constructed and safest pits he had ever encountered, he found himself facing the very death that he had managed to avoid throughout his career. As his strength failed and his vision darkened, Richard's last coherent thought was about the nature of the work that had defined his life. The collection of human waste was simultaneously one of the most essential and most dangerous occupations in medieval society. Men like him made urban civilization possible by ensuring that the byproducts of human habitation were safely removed and disposed of. Yet the work itself carried risks that could claim even the most experienced practitioners without warning. William's frantic efforts to rescue both men from the pit were ultimately only partially successful. He managed to pull Tom's unconscious body to the surface, where desperate attempts at revival eventually restored the young man's breathing and consciousness. Tom would survive the incident, though he would bear the effects of gas poisoning for the rest of his life, never again able to work in confined spaces without experiencing severe respiratory distress. Richard the Raker was not so fortunate. By the time William was able to organize a rescue effort and haul Richard's body from the bottom of the pit, life had already left the man who had made his living in London's depths. The official records of the city would note simply that Richard the Raker fell into a cesspit and drowned while collecting feces, a stark summary that captured neither the circumstances of his death nor the significance of his life's work. The aftermath of Richard's death revealed the complex social and economic relationships that surrounded the waste collection profession in medieval London. Thomas Coventry, the wealthy merchant whose cesspit had claimed Richard's life, was legally obligated to pay for the completion of the cleaning work as well as compensation to Richard's widow. The amount was substantial, 10 shillings, but it could never truly compensate for the loss of the family's primary breadwinner. Alice, Richard's widow, found herself in a position that was tragically common among the families of men who worked in dangerous occupations. With 2 children to support and no trade of her own, she had few options for generating income. The waste collection profession, despite its dangers, had provided a steady living that allowed her family to maintain a modest but stable household. Now that stability was gone, replaced by an uncertain future that would likely force her into less remunerative and more precarious forms of employment. The other rakers of London responded to Richard's death with a mixture of sorrow and resigned acceptance. Death was an occupational hazard that all of them understood and accepted as the price of their profession. They organized a collection among themselves to provide additional support for Alice and her children, demonstrating the solidarity that developed among men who faced shared dangers and social isolation. But Richard's death also prompted some reflection on the techniques and safety measures used in cesspit cleaning. Several of his colleagues began to experiment with methods for improving ventilation in deep pits, including the use of bellows to force fresh air into confined spaces before beginning excavation work. Others advocated for the use of ropes and harnesses that would allow a worker to be quickly pulled to safety if he showed signs of distress. These innovations, born from tragedy, represented the kind of practical knowledge that developed within trades through experience rather than formal education. Medieval society had no scientific understanding of the gases that made cesspit work dangerous, but practitioners like Richard had developed empirical knowledge about safety techniques through trial and error, success and failure, survival and death. The Coventry cesspit itself remained unfinished, its partial excavation serving as a grim reminder of the incident that had occurred there. Thomas Coventry eventually hired a different crew of rakers to complete the work, but only after extensive modifications to improve ventilation and safety. The pit was widened at the top to allow better air circulation, and the work was conducted in shorter shifts with more frequent breaks for fresh air. The story of Richard the Raker's death spread throughout London's community of waste collectors, becoming part of the oral tradition that passed safety knowledge from one generation to the next. Young men entering the profession learned not just the techniques of cesspit excavation, but also the cautionary tales that illustrated the dangers they would face. Richard's fate became a teaching story, a reminder that even the most experienced practitioners could not afford to become complacent about the risks inherent in their work. In the broader context of medieval London's development, Richard's death represented more than just an individual tragedy. It highlighted the human cost of the urban sanitation systems that made city life possible, reminding society that the convenience and cleanliness they enjoyed depended on the willingness of men like Richard to risk their lives in the service of public health. The stone-lined cesspit beneath Thomas Coventry's house would continue to serve the household for many years after Richard's death, eventually being emptied and refilled countless times by other rakers who learned from his experience. The physical infrastructure of waste management was durable and long-lasting, but the human infrastructure, the men who made the system work, was fragile and replaceable, their individual contributions quickly forgotten even as their collective labor remained essential. As winter settled over London in the weeks following Richard's death, the city's cesspits continued to fill with the daily waste of urban life. Other rakers took up the contracts that Richard could no longer fulfill, earning the wages that he would no longer collect. The work continued because it had to continue, regardless of the personal costs to those who performed it. And in the depths of London's underground, in the stone-lined chambers where human waste accumulated in darkness and silence, the city's hidden foundation remained solid, built on the labor and sacrifice of men whose names would be forgotten, but whose work would endure as long as civilization itself persisted in these crowded, thriving, and eternally needy streets. In the spring of 1547, as young Edward VI ascended to the throne of England and the Protestant Reformation began to reshape the religious landscape of the realm, a different kind of reformation was quietly taking place in the shadowy world of London's waste collectors. On a cold March evening, 16 men gathered in the back room of the Swan and Crow Tavern on Cock Lane, their faces bearing the telltale pallor and hollow-eyed appearance that marked those who spent their working lives in the depths of the city's cesspits. The tavern itself was an establishment that catered to London's night workers, the gong farmers, watchmen, bakers, and others, whose labour began when respectable society retired to their beds. The Swan and Crow's proprietor, a former gong farmer named Edmund Blackwater, who had saved enough money to purchase the business after a cart accident, ended his career in the pits, understood the peculiar needs of men whose very presence could clear a room of more conventional customers. The back room where the 16 gathered was separated from the main tap room by a heavy wooden door and thick stone walls that muffled sound. Here, surrounded by the familiar odours of their trade and protected from the curious stares of outsiders, the gong farmers could speak freely about the challenges and dangers that defined their working lives. Thomas Longpit, acknowledged as the most experienced gong farmer in London, had called this gathering to address what he saw as a crisis facing their profession. At 52 years old, Thomas had survived longer in the trade than any man had a right to expect, but his weathered hands and laboured breathing testified to the cumulative toll of 3 decades spent in cesspit work. His nickname came from his specialty in handling the deepest and most challenging excavations in the city, pits that other men considered too dangerous to attempt. "Brothers," Thomas began, using the term of address that gong farmers had adopted among themselves, "we gather tonight because our trade faces dangers that go beyond the pits themselves. The very foundations of our livelihood are being threatened by forces that we cannot control through skill or courage alone." The specific crisis that had prompted this unprecedented gathering involved recent changes in the regulatory environment governing waste disposal in London. The city authorities, influenced by new ideas about public health and urban planning that were filtering in from continental Europe, had begun to impose stricter requirements on cesspit construction and maintenance. While these regulations were intended to improve sanitation and reduce health risks, they also threatened to eliminate the traditional methods and practices that had sustained the gong farmer profession for generations. Among the new requirements was a mandate that all cesspits within the city walls be equipped with improved ventilation systems designed to prevent the accumulation of dangerous gases. The regulations also specified new standards for pit construction, including requirements for stronger stone lining and better drainage systems. Most significantly, the authorities had begun to discuss the possibility of requiring all cesspit cleaning to be supervised by licensed engineers who would be responsible for ensuring worker safety. For the gong farmers gathered in the Swan and Crow's back room, these developments represented both opportunity and existential threat. The new safety requirements might reduce the occupational hazards that claimed so many of their colleagues, but they also threatened to impose costs and bureaucratic oversight that could price traditional practitioners out of the market. Worse, the involvement of licensed engineers suggested that the authorities no longer trusted gong farmers to manage their own profession. Robert Ashpit, a gong farmer in his 30s who had inherited the trade from his father and grandfather, spoke for many in the room when he expressed skepticism about the motives behind the new regulations. "These rules come from men who have never descended into a cesspit," he argued. "They know nothing of the real conditions we face, yet they would tell us how to do work that their own fathers and grandfathers never dared attempt." The discussion that followed revealed the complex tensions within the gong farmer community itself. Some, particularly the younger men, welcomed the prospect of improved safety measures and official recognition of their profession. They had seen too many colleagues die from preventable accidents and believed that external oversight might finally force improvements in working conditions that the trade had been unable to achieve on its own. Others, especially those who had built successful independent practices, feared that regulation would destroy the economic advantages that came with their specialized knowledge and willingness to accept dangerous working conditions. The very risks that made cesspit cleaning so hazardous also made it lucrative for those who survived. New regulations might eliminate both the dangers and the financial rewards that justified accepting those dangers. William Deepwell, one of the younger men present, had brought with him a copy of the proposed regulations that his brother, a clerk in the city administration, had managed to obtain. As William read through the key provisions, it became clear that the authorities were contemplating changes that would fundamentally alter the nature of gong farmer work. The most significant proposal involved the establishment of a formal guild, structure for waste collectors, similar to the organizations that governed other trades and crafts in London. This guild would be responsible for training apprentices, establishing safety standards, negotiating contracts with the city administration, and ensuring that all practitioners met minimum competency requirements. For men who had always worked as independent contractors operating outside the formal economic structures that governed most trades, the prospect of guild membership represented both legitimization and constraint. Guild membership would provide legal recognition and protection, but it would also impose obligations and restrictions that many gong farmers had never experienced. Thomas Longpit, drawing on his decades of experience in the trade, outlined what he saw as the fundamental choice facing their profession. "We can continue as we have always done," he said, "working in isolation, competing against each other, losing men to preventable accidents, and remaining forever on the margins of respectable society. Or we can organize ourselves as other trades have done, presenting a united voice to the authorities and claiming our rightful place in the economic life of the city." The debate that followed would continue through most of the night, as 16 men grappled with questions that touched on everything from economic security to professional pride to the fundamental nature of their relationship with the society they served. Some argued that formal organization would lead inevitably to increased regulation and reduced independence. Others contended that only through collective action could gong farmers hope to improve their working conditions and social status. Henry Muckrake, one of the few gong farmers who could read and write, had prepared a detailed analysis of how guild structures functioned in other trades. He pointed out that successful guilds managed to balance collective interests with individual enterprise, providing support and protection for their members while still allowing for competition and innovation. "The goldsmiths have their guild," he noted, "yet there are still wealthy goldsmiths and poor ones, successful shops and failed ones. Organization does not eliminate opportunity. It creates a framework within which opportunity can be pursued more safely and effectively." The conversation also touched on the broader social changes that were reshaping Tudor England. The religious Reformation that was transforming the church was part of a larger pattern of institutional change that was affecting all aspects of English society. Traditional forms of authority and organization were being questioned and reformed, creating opportunities for previously marginalized groups to claim new forms of recognition and power. For gong farmers, who had always existed on the fringes of respectable society, the current period of social flux represented a unique opportunity to redefine their position. Rather than remaining forever associated with filth and degradation, they might be able to establish themselves as skilled professionals who provided essential services to urban civilization. As the night progressed and the ale flowed, the conversation gradually shifted from abstract principles to practical details. If they were to form a guild, how would it be structured? Who would serve as officers? How would they fund the organization? What specific benefits would guild membership provide to individual gong farmers? These questions revealed the deep divisions within the group. Some men had worked together for years and trusted each other implicitly, while others were rivals, who competed for the same contracts and customers. Some had accumulated substantial savings and owned their own tools and equipment, while others lived from job to job with no financial security. Some had family connections within the trade that went back generations, while others were newcomers who had entered the profession out of desperation rather than choice. Thomas Longpit, recognizing that these divisions could destroy any attempt at organization before it began, proposed a gradual approach to guild formation. Rather than trying to create a comprehensive organization immediately, They would begin with a simple mutual aid society that would provide support for the families of gong farmers who died or became disabled in the course of their work. This proposal had the advantage of addressing an immediate and universally recognized need while avoiding the more controversial aspects of formal guild organization. Every man in the room had seen colleagues die from occupational hazards, and most had contributed informally to support the widows and orphans left behind. Formalizing this support system would create a foundation of cooperation that could eventually be expanded into a more comprehensive organization. The practical details of such a mutual aid society were complex but manageable. Each member would contribute a portion of his earnings to a common fund, which would be used to provide financial support for families affected by workplace accidents. The society would also maintain records of its members' skills and experience, making it easier to find replacement workers when contracts needed to be fulfilled. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small windows of the Swan and Crow's back room, the 16 gong farmers reached a preliminary agreement to establish what they would call the Brotherhood of the Bucket and Rope. The name reflected both the tools of their trade and their commitment to mutual support in a profession that had traditionally isolated men from one another. But even as they shook hands and pledged their commitment to this new organization, each man wondered whether their solidarity would survive the pressures and temptations that had always divided their profession. The work that brought them together also created the conditions that drove them apart, and the very qualities that made a man successful as a gong farmer: independence, self-reliance, and willingness to accept risks that others would not, might also make him resistant to the compromises and cooperation that guild membership would require. What kind of brotherhood, they wondered, as they prepared to return to their separate lodgings and individual concerns, could be built among men whose work took them alone into the darkest depths of human necessity? Section 2. The Articles of Association. 3 months after the initial gathering at the Swan and Crow, the Brotherhood of the Bucket and Rope had grown to include 28 gong farmers representing every district of London where cesspit cleaning was regularly performed. The expansion had not been without its challenges, as news of the organization's formation had spread through the informal networks that connected men in the trade, attracting both genuine supporters and those who saw opportunity for personal advancement or disruption. The second formal meeting took place in a more ambitious setting, the Guild Hall of the Cordwainers Company, whose master, Richard Blackletter, had agreed to rent space to the fledgling organization after being approached by Thomas Longpit through a complex network of family connections and mutual acquaintances. The symbolism was intentional. By meeting in a recognized guild hall, the gong farmers were asserting their claim to legitimate professional status while demonstrating their understanding of proper institutional procedures. The months between the two meetings had been productive ones for the Brotherhood's informal leadership. Thomas Longpit, working with William Deepwell and Henry Muckrake, had drafted a preliminary set of articles that would govern the organization's structure and operations. These articles had been circulated among potential members, revised based on their feedback, and refined through countless conversations in taverns, workshops, and even cesspit sites throughout the city. The document that emerged from this collaborative process represented something unprecedented in the history of English labour organisation, a formal constitution created by and for men whose work had previously been governed only by individual contracts and informal traditions. The articles addressed everything from membership requirements to financial obligations to procedures for resolving disputes between members. Article the First established the fundamental purpose of the Brotherhood: to provide mutual aid and support for those who labour in the collection and disposal of human waste within the City of London and its environs, to promote the safety and prosperity of the trade, and to advance the reputation and standing of those who practice this necessary profession. The language was deliberately formal and respectful, reflecting the Brotherhood's desire to be taken seriously by both city authorities and other trade organizations. The emphasis on necessary profession represented a conscious effort to reframe public perception of gong farmer work, positioning it as essential public service rather than merely unpleasant manual labor. Article 2 defined membership eligibility in terms that balanced inclusivity with professional standards. Any man who has practiced the art of cesspit cleaning within the City of London for a period of not less than 1 year, who can demonstrate competency in the use of proper tools and techniques, and who is of good moral character as attested by 2 current members, shall be eligible for admission to the Brotherhood. This provision had generated considerable debate during the drafting process. Some members had wanted to restrict membership to men with family connections to the trade, while others had argued for completely open membership. The compromise language reflected recognition that the profession needed to attract new practitioners while maintaining standards that would protect both workers and customers. The question of moral character had been particularly contentious. Given the social stigma attached to gong farmer work, few members were in a position to make judgments about the respectability of their colleagues. However, the leadership had insisted on this requirement as a way of excluding men whose criminal behavior or excessive drinking might bring further disrepute to an already stigmatized profession. Article 3 established the Brotherhood's financial structure through a combination of membership dues and job-based assessments. Each member shall contribute 1 penny per week to the common fund, plus 1/10 part of all earnings from cesspit cleaning performed within the city boundaries. In return, members shall receive support in time of injury or illness, and their families shall receive assistance in the event of death or permanent disability. The financial provisions represented the most innovative aspect of the Brotherhood's organization. Previous attempts at cooperation among gong farmers had always founded on questions of money, who should contribute how much, who deserved support, and how funds should be managed. The new system attempted to balance individual responsibility with collective security, creating incentives for both productivity and mutual aid. The job-based assessment was particularly important because it aligned the Brotherhood's interests with those of individual members. Unlike a flat fee system that might discourage productivity, the percentage-based contribution meant that the organization would prosper when its members prospered. This alignment was designed to prevent the kind of conflicts between individual and collective interests that had destroyed previous cooperation attempts. Article 4 addressed what many members considered the most important function of the organization, the standardization of safety practices. The Brotherhood shall maintain and regularly update a code of safe working practices for cesspit cleaning, including procedures for assessing pit conditions, requirements for safety equipment, and protocols for emergency response. All members shall be trained in these practices and shall agree to follow them in their professional work. This provision represented a significant departure from traditional practice, where each gong farmer had developed his own methods based on personal experience and informal training. The standardization of safety practices would require experienced practitioners to share knowledge that they had previously guarded as trade secrets, while forcing all members to adopt techniques that might conflict with their individual preferences. The development of the safety code had been assigned to a committee led by Thomas Longpit, and including the most experienced members of the Brotherhood. Their work was based on systematic collection and analysis of information about accidents and near accidents throughout the trade, creating the first comprehensive study of occupational hazards in cesspit cleaning that had ever been attempted in England. The committee's preliminary findings were both sobering and enlightening. They had documented 17 deaths from cesspit accidents in London during the previous 5 years, along with numerous cases of serious injury and long-term health problems. Most significantly, their analysis revealed patterns in these incidents that suggested specific preventable causes rather than random misfortune. Nearly half of the documented deaths had occurred in pits deeper than 10 feet, suggesting that special precautions were needed for deep excavations. Most of the gas-related fatalities had happened during periods of still weather when air circulation was naturally reduced. Several accidents had involved structural failures in poorly maintained cesspits, indicating the need for systematic assessment of pit conditions before beginning work. Based on these findings, the Safety Committee had developed specific recommendations that would become part of the Brotherhood's mandatory practices. Deep pits would require 2-man teams with 1 worker remaining at the surface to assist in emergencies. All work would be suspended during periods when weather conditions reduced air circulation. Members would be trained to identify signs of structural instability and to refuse contracts involving unsafe working conditions. Article the 5th established procedures for contract negotiation and dispute resolution that represented another innovation in the organization of manual labor. The Brotherhood shall maintain standard rates for cesspit cleaning based on pit size, depth, and difficulty of access. Members shall not undercut these rates except under circumstances approved by the Governing Council. Disputes between members regarding contracts or working territories shall be resolved through binding arbitration by elected representatives of the Brotherhood. The standardization of rates addressed one of the most destructive aspects of competition among gong farmers. In their desperation to secure work, individual practitioners had often bid against each other in ways that drove down wages for everyone while encouraging dangerous shortcuts to maintain profitability. The new system would establish minimum rates that reflected both the skill required for the work and the risks involved in performing it. The territorial provisions were equally important as they addressed conflicts that had sometimes led to violence between competing gong farmers. Under the traditional system, prime locations, wealthy households with large cesspits that generated substantial fees, were often claimed by multiple practitioners, leading to bitter disputes that sometimes escalated into physical confrontations. The Brotherhood's arbitration system was designed to resolve these conflicts through peaceful means while recognizing the legitimate interests of all parties. Experienced members would serve as arbitrators, using their knowledge of local conditions and customary practices to reach fair settlements that preserved working relationships within the profession. As the 28 members gathered in the Cordwainers Hall worked through these articles line by line, the complexity of what they were attempting became increasingly apparent. They were not simply forming a mutual aid society or establishing professional standards, they were creating a new form of economic organization that challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between labor and society. The Brotherhood represented an assertion that even the most stigmatized and marginalized workers could organize themselves into effective institutions that served both individual and collective interests. By the autumn of 1548, the Brotherhood of the Bucket and Rope had established itself as a functioning organization with 43 members and a treasury containing nearly £8, a substantial sum that represented the collective contributions of men whose individual earnings rarely exceeded a few shillings per week. The Brotherhood's success had attracted the attention of both city authorities and other trade organizations, creating opportunities for recognition and advancement that had never before been available to gong farmers. The first major test of the organization's effectiveness came in the form of a crisis that threatened not just individual livelihoods, but the entire system of waste management that kept London habitable. A severe outbreak of what physicians called the sweating sickness had struck the city in late September, claiming hundreds of lives and creating a level of fear and desperation that paralyzed normal commercial activity. The disease, which modern historians believe may have been a form of influenza, spread rapidly through London's crowded neighborhoods, striking down healthy adults within hours of the first symptoms. The speed and severity of the outbreak led many citizens to flee the city, while those who remained barricaded themselves in their homes, afraid to venture into streets that seemed to carry death on every breeze. For the gong farmers of London, the epidemic created an impossible dilemma. The normal rhythms of their work required them to move through the city at night, entering households and working in close proximity to the waste products of families who might be harboring disease. Yet the very conditions that made their work dangerous also made it more essential than ever, as the accumulation of human waste in an already diseased city threatened to worsen an already catastrophic situation. The crisis came to a head when 3 gong farmers working independently, men who had refused to join the Brotherhood, died within a single week, apparently from the sweating sickness contracted during their work. Their deaths created panic among the remaining practitioners, many of whom simply stopped working rather than risk infection. Within days, the city's waste disposal system began to break down as cesspits overflowed and households had no way to arrange for cleaning services. Thomas Longpit, now recognized as the unofficial leader of the Brotherhood, found himself facing the most challenging decision of his career. The organization could suspend operations entirely, protecting its members from disease, but abandoning the city to the consequences of accumulated waste. Alternatively, they could continue working, accepting increased risks in exchange for the opportunity to demonstrate their essential role in urban civilization. The decision was made at an emergency meeting held in the cellar of St. Bartholomew's Church, the only location the Brotherhood could secure on short notice. The gathering included not just gong farmers but also representatives from the city administration who had come to plead for continued waste collection services. The presence of these officials at a meeting of men they would normally shun represented a remarkable acknowledgement of the Brotherhood's importance. Alderman Robert Whitmore, speaking for the City Council, made an unprecedented offer: official recognition of the Brotherhood as a legitimate guild, along with exclusive contracts for all cesspit cleaning within the city boundaries, in exchange for continued operations during the epidemic. The terms included hazard pay of double the normal rates and a commitment from the city to provide medical care for any Brotherhood members who contracted the disease while performing their duties. The offer represented everything the gong farmers had hoped to achieve through their organization: recognition, security, and financial compensation that reflected the true value of their work. Yet it came at a price that might include the lives of men who had joined the Brotherhood seeking protection from occupational hazards, not greater exposure to them. The debate that followed revealed both the strengths and the limitations of the organization they had built. Some members argued that accepting the city's offer would establish the Brotherhood as an essential institution that could never again be ignored or marginalized. Others contended that no amount of money or recognition was worth the risk of sending men to their deaths in a plague-stricken city. William Deepwell, who had emerged as one of the Brotherhood's most effective advocates, presented a compromise proposal that would allow the organization to serve the city while protecting its members. Rather than requiring all members to work during the epidemic, the Brotherhood would call for volunteers who would receive the hazard pay and medical benefits, while others remained safely inactive until the crisis passed. The volunteer system would be based on the mutual aid principles that had originally brought the organization together. Men who worked during the epidemic would be supporting not just the city, but their fellow gong farmers whose families would receive continued support from the Brotherhood's treasury even while the men themselves were unable to work. 21 members volunteered for epidemic duty, including Thomas Longpit despite his age and the accumulated health problems that made him particularly vulnerable to respiratory disease. The volunteers were organized into small teams that would work in rotation, reducing individual exposure while ensuring continuous service throughout the city. The Brotherhood also implemented unprecedented safety measures based on the limited medical knowledge available at the time. Volunteers would work in specially constructed masks filled with aromatic herbs believed to provide protection against disease transmission. They would wash their hands and tools with strong soap after each job and change their clothing frequently. Most importantly, they would avoid any direct contact with household members, receiving instructions and payment through intermediaries. The 6 weeks of epidemic duty that followed tested every aspect of the Brotherhood's organization and commitment. The volunteers worked under conditions that were both more dangerous and more stressful than anything they had previously experienced, knowing that each job might expose them to a disease that could kill within hours. Yet the shared sense of purpose and mutual support that the Brotherhood had fostered proved stronger than individual fear. Men who had once competed bitterly for contracts now worked together to ensure that no volunteer was left alone in a dangerous situation. The organization's treasury was used not just to support inactive members, but to purchase better equipment and supplies for those who continued working. The epidemic also revealed the true extent of the Gong farmers' knowledge about urban sanitation and public health. Working with city physicians, Brotherhood members were able to identify patterns in disease transmission that helped authorities understand how the sickness was spreading. Their observations about the correlation between overcrowded, poorly maintained cesspits and disease outbreaks provided valuable information that influenced subsequent public health policies. Most significantly, the Brotherhood's performance during the crisis fundamentally altered their relationship with London society. Citizens who had previously shunned Gong farmers now recognized them as heroes who had risked their lives to protect public health. The City Council formally acknowledged the organization as the Guild of Gong Farmers, granting them the same legal status and privileges enjoyed by other recognized trades. The human cost of this recognition was substantial. 7 of the 21 volunteers contracted the sweating sickness, and 3 died despite the medical care provided by the city. But their sacrifice was not forgotten by their colleagues or by the city they had served. The Brotherhood established a permanent fund to support the families of members who died in the line of duty, and the city erected a small monument in their honor, the first public recognition ever given to men who worked in waste collection. The success of the Brotherhood during the epidemic also attracted attention from Gong farmers in other English cities who began to organize similar guilds based on the London model. Within 2 years, organizations of waste collectors had been established in York, Bristol, and Norwich, creating a network of professional associations that shared information about safety techniques, wage standards, and political advocacy. The transformation of London's Gong farmers from isolated individuals to organized professionals represented more than just the evolution of a single trade. It demonstrated that even the most marginalized workers could create institutions that served both their own interests and the broader needs of society. The Brotherhood had proven that mutual aid and collective action could overcome the individual vulnerability that had always characterized dangerous occupations. As Thomas Longpit reflected on the changes that had occurred during his lifetime, he recognized that the young men entering the trade now faced opportunities and challenges that were fundamentally different from those he had encountered. The work itself remained dangerous and unpleasant, but it was no longer stigmatized in the same way. Gong farmers had achieved a form of respectability that came from recognized expertise and demonstrated social value. The guild structure that had emerged from their collective efforts provided a framework for continuing improvement in both working conditions and social status. Future generations of Gong farmers would build on the foundation that the Brotherhood had established, creating an institutional legacy that would outlast any individual practitioner. Yet questions remained about the long-term sustainability of the changes they had achieved. Would the guild structure prove durable enough to survive changes in technology and urban development? Could the solidarity that had been forged in crisis be maintained during periods of prosperity and stability? Would future generations of Gong farmers value the institutional inheritance they had received, or would they abandon collective organization in favor of individual opportunity? These questions could only be answered by time and experience, as the guild that had been born in the depths of London's cesspits faced the ongoing challenges of maintaining relevance and effectiveness in a rapidly changing world. In the rolling countryside of Oxfordshire, 20 miles south of the university town where scholars debated theology and natural philosophy, lay the Manor of Little Wickham, a collection of scattered farmsteads, common fields and woodland that had supported human habitation for over 3 centuries. The year 1348 found this rural community grappling with the same fundamental challenge that faced every agricultural settlement in medieval England: how to maintain soil fertility in a world where crop yields determined the difference between prosperity and starvation. The manor was home to approximately 47 souls, including the lord's family, free tenants, villeins bound to the land, and a handful of craftsmen whose skills were essential to the community's survival. Unlike the bustling cities where professional gong farmers plied their trade in specialized anonymity, Little Wickham operated according to agricultural rhythms that integrated waste management into the seasonal cycles of planting, cultivation, and harvest. At the center of this integrated system stood William Dung, whose surname accurately reflected both his primary occupation and his essential role in the manor's economy. At 35 years of age, William had inherited his position from his father and grandfather, becoming the 3rd generation of his family to serve as the community's principal collector and distributor of human waste. His work was neither glamorous nor particularly profitable, but it was recognized as fundamental to the agricultural prosperity that sustained everyone in Little Wickham. William's responsibilities extended far beyond simple collection and disposal. He served as the manor's expert on soil conditions, crop rotation, and the complex relationships between different types of organic matter and agricultural productivity. His knowledge encompassed not just human waste, but animal manure, kitchen scraps, ash from hearth fires, and the various plant materials that could be composted into soil amendments. This expertise made him an informal but influential advisor to both the manor lord and the tenant farmers who depended on his services. The physical infrastructure of waste management in Little Wickham reflected centuries of practical experimentation and gradual refinement. Each household maintained its own cesspit, typically located as far as possible from the dwelling while remaining accessible for regular emptying. These pits were lined with stones or timber to prevent collapse and were covered with wooden planks, or thatch to control odors and prevent contamination of groundwater. The design and location of these household cesspits required careful consideration of multiple factors. They had to be positioned downhill from wells and streams to prevent contamination of drinking water, yet close enough to buildings to be practical for daily use. The depth of each pit was determined by soil conditions, groundwater levels, and the size of the household it served. Most importantly, they had to be accessible to William's cart, which meant that their location was influenced by the topography of paths and roads throughout the manor. William's daily routine began before dawn, as he loaded his wooden cart with the tools and containers necessary for his rounds. The cart itself was a specialized piece of equipment, built with high sides and a tight-fitting cover that could contain both liquids and solids during transport. The wheels were iron-shod and designed to handle the rough terrain of rural paths, while the wooden body was treated with pine tar to make it waterproof and easier to clean. His tools included several different types of spades and scoops designed for working in confined spaces, leather buckets of various sizes, and a set of wooden planks that could be arranged to create a platform over a cesspit opening. He also carried materials for emergency repairs to damaged pit linings, as well as lime and ash that could be used to control odors and accelerate decomposition when necessary. The first stop on William's rounds was typically the manor house itself, where Sir Geoffrey Blackwood and his family generated waste that was both more voluminous and more valuable than that produced by peasant households. The dietary richness of the Lord's table, meat, imported spices, fine bread, made from wheat rather than barley, created waste that was prized by farmers for its supposed superior nutritional content for crops. The manor house cesspit was correspondingly elaborate, featuring stone lining and a drainage system that separated liquid waste from solid matter. The solid waste was removed by William on a regular schedule, while liquid waste was allowed to percolate into specially prepared soil beds where it could decompose without creating health hazards. This system represented the most advanced waste management technology available in rural England, combining engineering sophistication with practical agricultural knowledge. The economic relationships surrounding waste collection in Little Wickham were complex and reflected the broader social hierarchies that structured manor life. William received payment for his services in a combination of money, goods, and privileges that tied his welfare to the prosperity of the entire community. From the manor lord, he received a cottage and small plot of land rent-free plus cash, payments for special services. From tenant farmers, he received portions of their harvest in exchange for regular waste collection and distribution services. This payment system created incentives for William to maximize both the quantity and quality of waste he collected and distributed. Higher crop yields meant larger harvest shares for him, while more prosperous households generated more valuable waste. His economic interests were thus aligned with the agricultural success of the entire manor, making him a stakeholder in community prosperity rather than simply a service provider. The seasonal rhythms of William's work reflected the agricultural calendar that governed all aspects of manor life. Spring was the busiest season, as accumulated winter waste was distributed to fields being prepared for planting. Summer involved regular collection rounds and the management of composting areas, where waste was processed and aged. Autumn brought the application of fresh waste to fields that would lie fallow during winter, while winter was devoted to maintaining equipment and planning for the coming year's activities. The distribution of waste throughout the manor's agricultural lands required sophisticated knowledge of soil conditions, crop requirements, and the chemical properties of different types of organic matter. Fresh human waste was never applied directly to growing crops, as farmers understood that this could lead to contamination and disease. Instead, it was composted with other organic materials for periods ranging from several months to over a year, depending on intended use and local conditions. William maintained several composting areas throughout the manor, each designed for different types of waste and intended applications. Fresh waste was initially deposited in pits, where it was mixed with straw, ash, and kitchen scraps, then covered with soil to control odors and accelerate decomposition. As the material aged and decomposed, it was transferred to different pits and eventually distributed to fields according to a rotation schedule that William had developed through years of observation and experimentation. The knowledge required for effective waste management was extensive and largely empirical, passed down through generations of practical experience rather than formal education. William understood which types of waste produced the best results for different crops, how weather conditions affected decomposition rates, and what signs indicated that compost was ready for agricultural use. This knowledge represented a form of scientific understanding that was developed through systematic observation and experimentation, even though it was not recognized as such by medieval society. The social position of men like William was ambiguous and often contradictory. On one hand, their work was essential to agricultural productivity and was recognized as skilled labor that required expertise and experience. They were often consulted on matters related to crop rotation, soil improvement, and agricultural planning, giving them influence that extended beyond their formal social status. On the other hand, the nature of their work inevitably associated them with filth and contamination in the minds of their neighbors. They were necessary, but not necessarily, respected, valued, but not socially elevated. This contradiction created a form of social isolation that was different from but related to the stigma faced by urban gong farmers. The integration of waste management into the agricultural economy of Little Wickham represented a circular system that maximized the utilization of all organic materials produced by human activity. Nothing was truly waste in the modern sense. Everything was input for some other process that contributed to the community's survival and prosperity. Human excrement became soil fertilizer, kitchen scraps became compost, ash became soil amendment, and even the straw used for bedding eventually found its way into the agricultural cycle. This circular economy was both more efficient and more sustainable than the linear waste disposal systems that characterized urban areas. Rural communities like Little Wickham could absorb and productively utilize all the waste they generated, while cities required elaborate systems for transporting waste beyond their boundaries where it could be safely disposed of or sold to agricultural areas. Yet the rural system also imposed constraints and limitations that shaped every aspect of community life. The carrying capacity of the agricultural land determined the maximum population that could be sustained, while the productivity of the soil influenced the prosperity and security that residents could achieve. William's work was thus central to the fundamental challenge of balancing human population with environmental resources, a challenge that would become increasingly difficult as population growth and economic development put pressure on traditional agricultural systems. As William loaded his cart for another day's rounds through the familiar landscape of Little Wickham, he carried with him not just the physical waste of his neighbors, but the responsibility for maintaining the delicate balance that kept the community fed and prosperous. His work connected the most basic biological functions of human existence with the complex agricultural systems that made civilized life possible in the medieval countryside. What would happen, he sometimes wondered, if the population continued to grow or if the weather patterns that determine crop yields began to change in unpredictable ways? How long could the circular economy of waste and renewal sustain a community? That depended entirely on the productivity of the soil beneath their feet. The spring of 1348 arrived early at Little Wickham, with March bringing unseasonably warm weather that awakened the dormant agricultural cycle ahead of schedule. For William Dung, this early spring meant an intensification of his already demanding routine, as the accumulated waste of winter needed to be processed and distributed to fields that were ready for planting weeks before the traditional schedule. Thus, winter months had been particularly challenging for waste management throughout the manor. Extended periods of freezing weather had made it impossible to excavate material from household cesspits, while heavy snow had blocked many of the paths that William's cart normally followed. As a result, several cesspits had reached capacity, creating sanitation problems that threatened the health of the entire community. William's first priority was addressing these overflowing cesspits before they contaminated wells or created breeding grounds for disease. Working with his eldest son, 15-year-old Robert, he began a systematic campaign to empty the most problematic pits and transport their contents to the composting areas where winter accumulations could be processed for spring application. This father-son partnership represented more than just practical cooperation. It was part of the informal apprenticeship system through which knowledge about waste management was transmitted from one generation to the next. Robert had been accompanying his father on rounds since he was 8 years old, gradually learning the skills and knowledge that would eventually make him capable of taking over the family responsibility. The education that Robert received was comprehensive and practical, covering everything from the technical aspects of cesspit construction to the social diplomacy required for working with different types of households. He learned to assess soil conditions by texture, color, and smell, to identify signs of disease or contamination in waste materials, and to plan distribution schedules that maximized agricultural benefit while minimizing health risks. Most importantly, Robert was learning the ecological thinking that underlay all effective waste management. In agricultural communities, he had to understand how different types of organic matter decomposed under various conditions, how soil chemistry affected crop growth, and how weather patterns influenced both decomposition rates and optimal timing for field applications. The composting areas that William maintained throughout Little Wickham represented sophisticated biotechnology based on centuries of empirical observation and experimentation. Each area was designed to optimize the natural processes that converted raw organic matter into soil amendments using carefully controlled combinations of materials, moisture, temperature, and time to produce consistent results. The largest composting area, located on a hillside behind the manor house, covered nearly half an acre and was divided into sections representing different stages of the decomposition process. Fresh waste was deposited in the newest section, where it was immediately covered with layers of straw, leaves, and ash to begin the controlled decomposition process. As materials aged, they were moved through successive sections until they reached the final stage where fully composted material was ready for agricultural application. The management of these composting areas required constant attention and adjustment based on weather conditions, moisture levels, and the rate of decomposition in different sections. William had developed a complex understanding of the factors that accelerated or retarded decomposition, allowing him to produce finished compost on a schedule that matched the agricultural calendar. During periods of excessive moisture, he would add more absorbent materials like straw or sawdust to prevent anaerobic conditions that could create foul odors and attract vermin. During dry periods, he would add water or liquid waste to maintain the moisture levels necessary for active decomposition. The temperature of different sections was monitored by touch, as William had learned to recognize the optimal heat that indicated healthy microbial activity. The spring distribution of composted waste followed patterns that had been refined through generations of agricultural experience. Fields that would be planted with grain crops received heavier applications of aged compost, while vegetable gardens received lighter applications of more recent material. Pastures where animals grazed were treated with liquid waste that had been diluted and allowed to age until it no longer posed health risks to livestock. William's distribution schedule was coordinated with the planting activities of every household in the manor, requiring detailed knowledge of each farmer's intentions and timing. Some fields required waste application several weeks before planting to allow the nutrients to become available to growing plants. Others were best treated immediately before sowing to provide nutrients during the critical early stages of plant growth. The transportation of processed waste from composting areas to agricultural fields presented logistical challenges that required careful planning and coordination. William's cart could carry perhaps a quarter-ton of material per trip, meaning that major distribution operations required dozens of round trips over several days or weeks. The timing of these operations had to account for weather conditions, field accessibility, and the labor demands of other agricultural activities. The routes that William followed during distribution were determined by a combination of practical and agricultural considerations. Heavy loads required paths that could support his cart without damage, while the sequence of applications was determined by the optimal timing for different crops and soil conditions. These routes had been established over generations and represented a accumulated knowledge about the most efficient ways to serve the agricultural needs of the entire manor. The spring of 1348 also brought new challenges that tested William's expertise and adaptability. Reports from travellers suggested that a serious disease was spreading through continental Europe, potentially threatening England later in the year. While the nature and severity of this threat remained unclear, William began to modify his practices to reduce the risk of disease transmission through waste materials. These modifications included longer composting periods for all waste materials, more extensive use of lime and ash as disinfectants, and stricter separation between fresh waste and materials that were ready for agricultural use. William also began to pay closer attention to signs of illness among the manor's residents, as changes in waste characteristics could provide early warning of health problems that might affect the entire community. The agricultural applications of composted waste during this spring produced results that exceeded William's expectations. The early warm weather, combined with the nutrients provided by properly aged compost, created optimal growing conditions that promised exceptional harvests if favourable weather continued throughout the growing season. The grain fields showed particularly strong early growth, with wheat and barley plants establishing robust root systems that suggested they would be able to withstand summer heat and drought. The vegetable gardens around individual households also responded well to waste applications, producing early crops that provided fresh food after the limited diet of winter months. The success of these early applications reinforced William's reputation as an expert in soil management and agricultural planning. Tenant farmers who had initially been skeptical of his distribution recommendations were now seeking his advice on crop selection and field preparation. Even Sir Geoffrey Blackwood consulted with William about plans for expanding the manor's agricultural productivity. This growing recognition of William's expertise reflected broader changes in agricultural knowledge and practice that were occurring throughout medieval England. As population growth put pressure on food production, traditional farming methods were being supplemented with more intensive techniques that required greater understanding of soil chemistry and plant nutrition. William's knowledge of waste management positioned him at the forefront of these agricultural innovations. His understanding of how different types of organic matter affected soil fertility made him a valuable advisor on questions that extended far beyond simple waste disposal. He was becoming a specialist in what modern scientists would call soil ecology, even though medieval society had no such terminology. The social implications of William's growing expertise were complex and sometimes contradictory. His increasing influence on agricultural decisions elevated his status within the manor community, giving him a voice in planning discussions that had traditionally been dominated by the lord and his most prosperous tenants. Yet his continued association with waste collection also reinforced the social boundaries that separated him from more respectable occupations. This contradiction was particularly evident in his relationship with the manor's priest, Father Edmund, who valued William's knowledge about agricultural matters but remained uncomfortable with the source of that knowledge. The Church's teachings about cleanliness and contamination created theological concerns about work that involved such intimate contact with human waste, even when that work served essential community needs. The tension between practical necessity and religious doctrine was not unique to William's situation, but it highlighted the complex social negotiations that surrounded all aspects of waste management in medieval society. Communities needed the services that men like William provided, but they also needed to maintain social and religious boundaries that preserved their sense of order and respectability. As summer approached and the agricultural cycle moved toward its most critical phase, William found himself increasingly central to the manor's economic planning and social organization. His work had evolved from simple waste collection to comprehensive resource management, encompassing everything from soil improvement to agricultural planning to community health protection. The approaching harvest season would test both his technical expertise and his social position within the manor community. If the crops that had benefited from his waste applications produced exceptional yields, his reputation and influence would be further enhanced. If disease or agricultural failure struck the manor, he might face blame for problems that were beyond his control but related to his area of responsibility. As William loaded his cart for another day's work in the fields of Little Wickham, he carried with him the accumulated knowledge of generations of agricultural practice and the hopes of a community that depended on his expertise for their survival and prosperity. The rhythm of seasons that governed his work also governed the larger patterns of life and death, feast and famine, that determined the fate of everyone who shared this small corner of medieval England. What challenges and opportunities would the coming harvest season bring to test the systems and relationships that had sustained the manor through countless agricultural cycles? The summer of 1348 brought to Little Wickham a series of events that would test every aspect of the agricultural and social systems that had sustained the manor for generations. The exceptional early growth that had promised record harvests was followed by weather patterns that challenged William Duncart's expertise and the resilience of the entire community. By mid-June, reports reaching the manor confirmed that the disease rumoured from continental Europe had arrived in England and was spreading through port cities with devastating effect. What would later be known as the Black Death had begun its march across the English countryside, transforming every aspect of social and economic life in its path. For William, the approaching plague created dilemmas that had no precedent in the traditional knowledge passed down through his family. The waste management practices that had served the manor for centuries suddenly needed to be reconsidered in light of disease transmission risks that were poorly understood but clearly deadly. The first case of plague in Little Wickham appeared in late June, striking down Thomas Miller, a prosperous tenant farmer whose family had lived on the manor for 4 generations. Thomas died within 3 days of showing symptoms, and within a week, 2 members of his household had also succumbed to the disease. The rapid progression and high mortality rate created panic throughout the community and presented William with unprecedented challenges. The traditional practice of composting human waste required extended contact with potentially contaminated materials, creating risks that might expose William to fatal disease. Yet abandoning waste collection entirely would create sanitation problems that could worsen disease transmission and threaten the survival of those who had not yet been infected. Working with Father Edmund and Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, William developed modified procedures designed to minimize disease risks while maintaining essential sanitation services. Fresh waste from households where plague had appeared would be isolated in special pits located far from any water sources and left untouched for extended periods before being processed. Waste from healthy households would continue to be collected and composted, but with additional precautions, including the use of lime and prolonged aging periods. These modifications required William to reorganize his entire operation, creating separate routes and schedules for different types of collection while maintaining the agricultural applications that the manor's crops required. The additional labor and complexity strained his resources, while the growing fear of disease made it increasingly difficult to find assistance for his work. The plague's impact on Little Wickham's agricultural system extended far beyond waste management. As the disease claimed victims throughout the summer, the manor faced severe labor shortages that threatened the harvest of crops that had shown such promise earlier in the year. Fields that required intensive cultivation were left unattended, while the fear of contagion disrupted the cooperative work patterns that normally sustained agricultural activities. William found himself taking on responsibilities that extended far beyond his traditional role. With many of the manor's most experienced farmers either dead or incapacitated, he became an informal coordinator for agricultural activities, using his knowledge of soil conditions and crop requirements to guide planting and cultivation decisions made by inexperienced workers. The irony was not lost on William that the knowledge he had gained through his stigmatized profession was now essential to the manor's survival. His understanding of soil fertility, developed through years of managing waste applications, made him one of the few residents capable of making informed decisions about crop management during the crisis. The harvest itself, when it finally came, in August and September, reflected both the promise and the tragedy of that extraordinary year. The fields that had received optimal waste applications and adequate cultivation produced yields that exceeded anything in the manor's recorded history. But many fields were only partially harvested due to labor shortages, while others were left entirely untouched as their owners had succumbed to disease. William organized work teams from among the survivors to salvage as much of the harvest as possible, using his knowledge of different crops and optimal timing to prioritize efforts where they would have the greatest impact. The grain that was successfully harvested was stored in the manor's granaries under his supervision, as he had become one of the few people trusted to make decisions about resource allocation and distribution. The social transformations that accompanied the plague's devastation of Little Wickham challenged every aspect of the traditional hierarchy that had governed manor life. With nearly half the population dead or fled, the strict distinctions between lord and tenant, free and bonded, respectable and stigmatized occupations became difficult to maintain. William's elevation from waste collector to informal agricultural coordinator reflected broader changes occurring throughout plague-affected regions of England. Traditional authorities were decimated by disease, while practical knowledge and demonstrated competence became more important than hereditary status or formal position. Yet these changes also created new tensions and conflicts within the surviving community. Some residents resented William's increased influence and authority, viewing it as inappropriate elevation of someone whose work had always been associated with filth and contamination. Others recognized that their survival depended on his expertise and leadership, creating divisions that reflected different perspectives on social change and community priorities. The winter of 1348-1349 brought additional challenges as the reduced population struggled to maintain the agricultural and social systems that had sustained the manor in previous years. William found himself responsible not just for waste management, but for planning crop rotations, managing stored grain supplies, and coordinating the limited labor available for essential activities. The waste management challenges of that winter were unlike anything in William's experience. With a drastically reduced population, the volume of waste requiring collection and processing had declined significantly. However, the social disruption caused by the plague had led to the abandonment of many household cesspits, creating sanitation problems that threatened the health of survivors. William developed new strategies for managing waste in a partially depopulated community, including the consolidation of collection routes and the conversion of some former agricultural areas into composting sites for long-term waste processing. These adaptations required him to rethink fundamental assumptions about the relationship between population, waste production, and agricultural needs. The spring of 1349 brought both renewal and continued uncertainty to Little Wickham. The survivors had endured the worst of the plague, but they faced the challenge of rebuilding agricultural and social systems with drastically reduced resources. William's role in this reconstruction was central, as his expertise in soil management and agricultural planning made him essential to efforts to restore productive farming. The fields that received waste applications that spring were fewer in number, but were treated with greater intensity than ever before. With abundant composted waste available from reduced population and careful management, William was able to apply nutrients at levels that promised exceptional productivity for those areas that could be adequately cultivated. The crops planted in 1349 grew in soil that had been enriched not just by processed waste, but by the decomposed remains of abandoned homesteads and neglected fields. The organic matter that had accumulated during the plague year created fertility levels that produced harvests of unprecedented abundance for the reduced population that remained. Yet the success of these agricultural efforts could not fully compensate for the social and economic devastation that the plague had brought to Little Wickham. The manner that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from the community that had existed before 1348, with altered social relationships, different economic structures, and changed expectations about authority and responsibility. William's position in this transformed community reflected the broader changes that the plague had brought to English society. His expertise and leadership during the crisis had elevated him from a marginalized service provider to a central figure in community decision-making. Yet this elevation came at the cost of traditional social structures that had provided stability and predictability for generations. As William surveyed the fields of Little Wickham in the autumn of 1349, he saw landscapes that were both more fertile and more empty than any in the manor's memory. The agricultural techniques that he had refined through years of waste management had proven their worth in creating abundance from soil enriched by careful application of organic matter. But the community that might have benefited from this abundance had been devastated by forces that no amount of agricultural expertise could have prevented. The circular economy of waste and renewal that had sustained Little Wickham for centuries continued to function, but it now operated within a social and demographic context that was fundamentally altered. The balance between population and resources that had shaped all aspects of manor life had been disrupted in ways that would influence agricultural and social development for generations to come. The lessons that William had learned about sustainable agriculture and resource management would survive and influence future generations, but they would be applied in a world where the relationship between human communities and their environment had been permanently changed by the catastrophic events of 1348-1349. As he prepared for another winter of modified waste management in a transformed community, William carried with him both the knowledge that had sustained his ancestors and the adaptability that the crisis had demanded. The work that had once been simply about collecting and distributing waste had become central to the challenge of rebuilding civilization itself in the aftermath of unprecedented disruption. What new forms of community and agricultural practice would emerge from the lessons learned during this time of testing, and how would the knowledge gained through generations of waste management contribute to the reconstruction of rural life in post-plague England? As dawn breaks over the landscapes of medieval England, from the stone-lined cesspits of Tudor London to the compost-enriched fields of plague-ravaged Little Wickham, we witness the end of another night's labor in humanity's eternal struggle with its own biological necessities. The men who emerged from the darkness, Thomas Muckhart adjusting his leather apron, Richard the Raker climbing his final ladder, the members of the Brotherhood of the Bucket and Rope gathering for their morning ale, William Dung surveying fields transformed by his knowledge, carried with them more than the tools of their trade. They carried the weight of civilization itself, shouldered in buckets and barrels, measured in loads of night soil that would become tomorrow's harvest. In their calloused hands and poison-stained lungs lay the foundation upon which all urban comfort and rural prosperity ultimately rested. For without these forgotten guardians of sanitation, the great cities would have drowned in their own waste, and the countryside would have starved on depleted soils. The stories we have followed through these long hours reveal truths that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of medieval waste management. They illuminate the fundamental paradox that has always characterized human civilization, that our highest achievements depend upon our willingness to confront our most basic and unpleasant necessities. The cathedrals and universities, the merchant houses and royal palaces of medieval England all rose from foundations built by men who descended nightly into the depths of human excrement. These were not merely stories of individual hardship or occupational hazard, but chronicles of social systems that depended upon the labor of those they preferred to ignore. The gong farmers and night soil men, the village dung cart operators and manor waste collectors occupied positions that were simultaneously central and marginal, essential and despised. Their work made possible the very social hierarchies that excluded them from respectability and recognition. Yet within these seemingly humble professions, we discover forms of knowledge and expertise that rivaled those of any medieval craft or science. The ability to read the layers of a cesspit like a scholar reading a manuscript, to understand the complex chemistry of decomposition and soil fertility, to organize the logistics of waste collection and distribution across entire communities, these skills represented sophisticated understanding of natural processes and human systems that was gained through direct experience rather than formal education. The evolution of these professions from individual survival strategies to organized guilds and professional associations demonstrates the capacity of even the most marginalized workers to create institutions that served both their own interests and broader social needs. The Brotherhood of the Bucket and Rope was not merely a mutual aid society, but an assertion that expertise deserved recognition regardless of its social origins, and that workers could organize themselves to improve both their own conditions and the services they provided to society. The environmental dimensions of medieval waste management reveal an understanding of ecological relationships that modern society has often forgotten in its pursuit of convenience and technological solutions. The circular economy that transformed human waste into agricultural fertilizer represented a form of sustainability that maximized the productive use of all organic materials while minimizing environmental degradation. These systems were not perfect. They carried health risks and imposed social costs that we would find unacceptable today, but they demonstrated principles of resource conservation and reuse that remain relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. The human cost of these systems, however, was substantial and should not be romanticized. The shortened lifespans, occupational diseases, and social stigma endured by waste collectors represented real suffering that was the price of medieval sanitation. The deaths of men like Richard the Raker were not heroic sacrifices but tragic consequences of inadequate safety measures and limited understanding of occupational health risks. Yet these costs were not distributed randomly or accepted passively. The development of safety practices, the organization of mutual support systems, and the gradual improvement of working conditions reflected the ongoing efforts of workers themselves to reduce the human price of essential labor. The knowledge, gained through experience and shared through informal networks, represented a form of practical science that contributed to the gradual improvement of both working conditions and public health. The social dynamics revealed in these stories also illuminate broader patterns of inclusion and exclusion that characterized medieval society. The stigmatization of waste collectors reflected deep-seated anxieties about contamination and social boundaries that extended far beyond concerns about hygiene or health. The work of handling human waste carried symbolic meanings related to social hierarchy, religious purity, and cultural values that made it difficult for practitioners to gain full acceptance regardless of their skill or social contribution. These symbolic dimensions of waste work continue to influence contemporary attitudes toward sanitation workers, environmental cleanup, and other occupations that involve contact with materials society considers polluting or degraded. The medieval experience suggests that technological improvements alone are insufficient to address the social challenges faced by workers in these essential but stigmatized occupations. The regional variations in waste management practices, from the urban gong farmers of London to the agricultural waste recyclers of rural manors, demonstrate how environmental, economic, and social factors combine to create different solutions to universal human needs. These variations remind us that there is no single optimal approach to waste management, but rather a range of strategies that must be adapted to local conditions and community resources. The disruptions caused by events like the plague of 1348 reveal both the fragility and the resilience of these waste management systems. When social structures collapsed and populations declined, the knowledge and practices developed over generations proved adaptable enough to serve transformed communities. This adaptability was largely due to the practical, experience-based nature of the knowledge involved, which could be modified and applied to new circumstances without requiring extensive formal reorganization. As we reflect on these medieval experiences from our contemporary perspective, we are reminded that every society must find ways to handle the waste products of human habitation, and that these solutions inevitably involve both technological and social dimensions. The specific methods used by medieval communities are no longer practical or desirable, but the underlying challenges they addressed remain fundamentally unchanged. The men whose stories we have followed through these dark hours worked in the depths so that others might live in the light. Their labor was unglamorous and often dangerous, but it was also creative and essential. They transformed waste into wealth, contamination into cultivation, social problems into agricultural solutions. They built the hidden infrastructure that made civilization possible while remaining themselves largely invisible to the civilizations they served. In remembering their names and honoring their contributions, we acknowledge our own dependence on those who continue to perform the essential but undervalued work of waste management in our contemporary world. The garbage collectors and sewage treatment workers, the environmental cleanup specialists and sanitation engineers of today are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back through centuries of human ingenuity and sacrifice. Their work, like that of their medieval predecessors, reminds us that civilization is not a finished achievement, but an ongoing project that requires constant maintenance and renewal. It depends not only on our highest aspirations and greatest achievements, but also on our willingness to confront and manage the less pleasant realities of human existence. As the sun rises over the cities and countryside of our modern world, millions of people begin their daily routines secure in the knowledge that the waste they produce will be collected, processed, and disposed of by systems they rarely consider and workers they seldom see. This convenience, which we take for granted, rests upon foundations laid centuries ago by men who descended into darkness so that society might emerge into light. The boring history of waste collection is, ultimately, the fascinating history of human adaptation, social organization, and the endless creativity with which our species has addressed its most fundamental challenges. In the depths of medieval cesspits and the cycles of agricultural renewal, we find reflections of our own ongoing struggles to create sustainable, equitable, and humane communities in a world that continues to generate both waste and wonder in equal measure. And so the work continues as it always has and always must in the darkness before dawn when the collectors make their rounds, ensuring that when the rest of us wake to face another day, the foundations of our civilization remain solid beneath our feet.